Loyalty isn't your armor. It's your Achilles heel, the fragile spot no one warns you about until it's too late. You gave everything, laid down every piece of yourself in the silent hope that this time would be different. But the cold truth greets you in the dark. Giving everything doesn't guarantee anything. You thought devotion built a fortress strong enough to hold her close, but it was the very thing that tore you apart. When she walked away, it wasn't just her body leaving. It felt like your essence was being stripped from your bones. You sit with that emptiness, listening closely to the void she left behind, the hollowness louder than any words she never spoke, heavier than the silence you now carry. You replay the moments, the promises, the nights you sacrificed, only to realize loyalty is not a currency others respect. It's a debt you paid in full and never recovered. This isn't just betrayal from her. It's the slow collapse of the belief that your worth was tied to unreciprocated devotion. You thought standing firm with unwavering loyalty would draw her back, pull the storm inside you into calmer waters. Instead, the storm only sharpened, carving deeper into your soul. You thought being indispensable meant you'd always be chosen, that your commitment was a map guiding her home. But there's a brutal distance between being needed and being wanted, between being counted on and being embraced. That battleground where your loyalty lay was not where you fought for respect. It was where you lost yourself waiting. You built a kingdom on shifting sand, hoping the tide wouldn't wash you away. Now you see, loyalty is a weight, not a shield. And sometimes the hardest lesson is to stop bearing what no one will carry with you. You're not the hero of her story anymore, but the quiet soldier who's learned that what truly matters isn't the war you fought for her. It's the fight you reclaim for yourself. You walked through hell and never raised your voice. Now your silence speaks louder than all her leaving ever could. You've been told to open up, to strip down the walls so your emotions can breathe. The modern gospel for men who want to be seen as whole, real, available. But here you are, standing in the aftermath, realizing that vulnerability was never the key to being heard. It was the lock that threw you into silence. Why does loyalty make us invisible? Why does showing your heart feel like lowering your guard in a battlefield, only to be left exposed, overlooked, and dismissed? You gave her your steady hands, your honest words, your time unraveled like a broken thread in a storm, and yet that same loyalty blurred you into background noise, something to be taken for granted but never truly seen. The world screams, "Be sensitive, be open." But inside, you're learning that sensitivity is no longer a bridge. It's a razor's edge cutting you deeper every time you try to reach across the void. You felt the weight of your own devotion, how it wasn't lifting you, but dragging you down, like shackles forged from the very softness you were told to carry. You stood at the shore, heart pounding louder than the relentless thunder of waves crashing against worn rock, trying to be the constant in lives that shifted without warning. And the more you showed your true self, the scars, the hopes, the quiet strengths, the less you became to them. You disappeared into the mist, like a ghost abandoned on the battlefield because being good isn't enough when the world demands fire, unpredictability, something sharper than the steady pulse of loyalty. Has respect become the myth we chase but never catch? The conversations that once felt like holy ground now feel like cold silences, where your words fall into cracks, swallowed by indifference. This unbearable tension, being told you're strong for feeling, but punished for it in every moment after, breaks you in ways no one talks about, the slow fracture of being engulfed by the very openness you thought would save you. You remember the promise, emotional availability will build bridges. But what it built was a quarantine, a space where your affections sat alone, orphaned among unspoken expectations and misunderstood intentions. Respect and care you offered came back fractured, like echoes in an empty hall, and you wonder if the very threads meant to tie us together are the ones unraveling you, silently, thoroughly. And in that deafening silence, where no one notices your retreat, you start to ask yourself the questions no one else will. Why does being good, earnest, and committed feel like abandonment? Why have the virtues you carry become the currency of invisibility? It's a quiet storm inside, a wrestling match with the weight of being both too much and never enough. You were cast as the steady wolf who stands his ground, but somehow the pack can't see him. And that's the harsh truth. The world demands your soul open wide, but does not promise you will be respected for it. You learned the hard way that being real doesn't guarantee you a place in their story. Sometimes it just means you stare back into a void that never blinks. You've been dragged through the storm, battered by waves you never asked to face. But here's the truth. Nobody says. Pain isn't a curse. It's the hammer that shapes the steel inside you. Imagine yourself as a storm-tested oak, rooted deep where the soil is thick with unshakable values, hidden from the chaos above. The winds of rejection, disrespect, loss, they'll bend your branches, maybe even tear at your leaves. But your trunk, the core of your being that stays hard and steady, you can feel the cracking, the pressure. Good. That means the fire is burning where it's supposed to, inside the forge that's refining you. You don't get to decide how hard the storm will blow. What you do control is whether you break or you anchor deeper. Marcus was a man much like you. Spent years chasing after approval like a dog chasing its tail. The weight of other men's judgments, the hunger for a nod from a world that barely noticed his efforts. It was exhausting. Then one day he stopped. Not because the world changed, but because he refused to be a man who bends just to be seen. He pulled back from the edge of that desperate chase and stood silent, pulled tight like a bowstring. In that refusal, a strange calm settled. His body stopped burning with the fever of approval. The tension in his shoulders eased. His strength reached past the surface to the roots, deeper than the storm's reach. He wasn't less because he stopped begging for acknowledgement. He was more. His armor was forged in that choice, solid, invisible, undeniable. Stoicism isn't about shutting down. It's about turning pain into your weapon, turning chaos into the cold light of reason. It's the lighthouse in the thrashing sea that guides you back to yourself when the waves roar, "You're nothing, boy." You don't get to pick the bitterness life hands you, but you decide whether to swallow it or use it to carve out the man you're meant to become. The pain you carry isn't an enemy. It's the stern instructor who grinds you into a man who won't crack under pressure. Remember that when you're alone and the silence fills your room, your wounds are the anvil beneath your soul. This is no call to hold fast to weakness, but to rise as the unyielding oak rooted in your conviction. You walked through fire and kept your voice low, because a real warrior knows the loudest battles are fought in silence. Your pain is the forge, your resolve the hammer. Every man who masters himself knows. You don't find peace by running from the storm. You find it by standing tall while it rips at your branches. The storm blows, but you remain. You endure. You rise. Detachment is the first steel you forge in the fires of your heart. It's not about retreating into coldness or shutting down. It's about carving distance from the poison of needing approval, from the weight of others' opinions slowly corroding your will. When you stop leaning on the shaky scaffolding of external validation, you remove the rust that binds your edges, sharpening yourself to a lethal clarity. You're not turning your back on feeling. You're taking the reins as the author of your story. Your home isn't out there where the noise swells and fades with every eye, every whisper. It's inside, where the calm blood of purpose flows steady and silent. You build this fortress so no one's judgment can ever breach your walls again. Emotional control is your iron shield, forged not of denial, but mastery. The rage that burns like wildfire in your gut, the ache of longing, the weight of despair, they're weapons waiting for your command. Left unchecked, they'll slice deeper wounds into yourself than any enemy ever could. But when you learn to temper those flames into quiet strength, They become your discipline, not your downfall. You don't explode in storms that leave you hollow and scattered. Instead, you hold those feelings like a warrior holding a blade, steady, deliberate, unbreakable. You shape chaos into order, turning your emotions from a merciless enemy into a relentless sentinel guarding your inner citadel. Mission first. This is the fire that moves mountains beneath your feet. Your life is not an accident, not a script handed down by others. It's a path you blaze with every breath, a force that propels you forward when the world tries to drag you back into its gray, meaningless noise. Align yourself with a cause bigger than momentary pain, beyond broken illusions or fleeting distractions. This purpose becomes your backbone. It draws a line between you and those caught in the currents of drama, desperation, or despair. You're not a passenger lost in the crowd. You're the architect, the wolf carving a trail through the wilderness on a terrain only you know. Let that mission be the iron compass when everything around you blurs into chaos. Shift perspective like a seasoned sailor adjusting his sails to catch every whisper of the storm. Life will knock you sideways. Rejection, disrespect, loss, they strike with blunt force and sting like venom. But each wound carries a map forward if you look beyond the surface pain. Experience tempers you like steel hammered against the anvil. Every setback is fuel, every scar a lesson etched in bone. You stop seeing obstacles as ends and recognize them as triggers, pushing you to grow sharper, tougher, more precise. Your vision tightens, no longer caught in the immediate avalanche of harsh moments, but stretched out to the broad horizons where meaning lives. This is the quiet power of men who endure without complaint. Independence is your bedrock, the silent war cry beneath every move you make. The world loves to hand out chains disguised as comfort, to bait you with approval, friendship, or love only if you play by rules that aren't yours. But you don't settle for that half-life. You choose freedom instead, the raw, unfiltered kind that comes from standing alone and knowing you don't need anyone to prop you up. Your strength is a forged weapon born from solitude and truth. In this uncompromising liberty, respect finds you, not begged for or bargained with, but claimed like territory after battle. The Alpha does not plead. The Alpha does not explain. The Alpha elevates. You've walked through hell and never raised your voice. This is the unmistakable sound of a warrior who's come home. You've walked through shadows thick enough to drown 100 men. The winds howled for you to break, to stumble, to vanish. But here you stand, carved not by ease, but by relentless storms. This isn't survival anymore. It's something far sharper. You've become the anvil, the steel forged hotter by the flame of your own trials, colder only in your resolve. Whatever tried to shake you has instead become the weight you carry like a banner, proof that you are not your scars, you are their master. Those marks on your skin, etched deep in your memory, aren't reminders of brokenness. They are scripts of wisdom written in the language of fire and silence. No longer do you reach out, hoping for a nod, a glance, or a sign that you belong. You've stopped chasing shadows of approval. Validation isn't a gift from others. It's a fortress you build brick by silent brick inside yourself. Look in the mirror tonight. That reflection is no longer a stranger's judgment, but a ledger of battles met and overcome. You are the keeper of your worth. No one else holds that key. The old stories about who you should be have lost their power. You are not a character in someone else's tale. You are the author of your own legacy, steeled by patience, sharpened by discipline. A new dawn breaks, but you don't rise like the sun. Your rise is the slow crack of the earth beneath the weight of a man who stands firm. You don't shout your strength. You don't display your crown. You carry it quietly, without need for echo or witness. I stand, I grow, silence my fortress, inner peace my crown. That is your declaration. Not loud because it needs to be heard, but because it cannot be shaken. This is the place where you answer the call, not of others, but of your own spirit hardened through fire. The journey is not finished. It merely changes shape as you do. Unyielding, you move forward with the calm certainty of a wolf who has outrun the storm and now watches from the ridge. This is your moment of clarity and power. You don't explain, you elevate.